Last week, the Canadian Parliament gave a standing ovation for a war hero from the Second World War. Good for them, you might think, until you realise he fought in an SS unit. 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka was introduced to Canadian MPs on Friday and received a rapturous applause. That was tied in with Ukraine's President Zelensky addressing the chamber to thank Canada for supporting its fight against Russia. The Canadian House Speaker Anthony Rota hailed Hunka for fighting for, quote, Ukrainian independence against the Russians. Mr. Rota, Canada was on the same side as the Russians in the Second World War. 45,000 of your compatriots died fighting fascism. Rota has since apologised for the affair, but joining him on the apology train is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologised. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine, as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with Ukraine in Russia's illegal war against it.
Let me just quickly repeat those comments. It's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine. What does Russian propaganda have to do with the Parliament of Canada honouring a Nazi? Let me guess. Putin made you clap. It was disinformation. There is precisely zero remorse being shown there, by the way. In better news, however, it seems that Yaroslav Hunka, the 98-year-old, being catapulted to fame, may now have to face justice after fleeing Europe decades ago. That's because a Polish government minister, Przemysław Czarnek, has launched a bid to extradite Hunka. He posted this on Twitter. You can see this in both Polish and English. I'll read the English, obviously. In view of the scandalous events in the Canadian Parliament, which involved honouring in the presence of President Zelensky, a member of the criminal Nazi SS Galician formation, I have taken steps towards the possible extradition of this man to Poland. The letter attached to that tweet was sent to the head of the Institute of National Remembrance, the IPN, a Polish state body that has prosecutorial powers. It asked him to urgently establish whether Yaroslav Hunka is wanted for crimes against the Polish nation or Poles of Jewish origin. Such crimes constitute grounds for applying to Canada for his extradition, it adds in the letter. Now, something I've seen repeatedly is that those such as Hunka were fighting the Russians, defending their country. That simply isn't true. Most Ukrainians fought for the Red Army, and soldiers from the Ukrainian SS unit that Hunka belonged to were involved in the massacre of 850 ethnic Poles in the village of Huta Pięćka, which before the war was part of Poland but is now part of Ukraine. That unit also fought against Slovak and Yugoslav partisans. Precisely how killing Poles, Yugoslavs and Slovaks is helping Ukraine is anybody's guess. Hunka was among 600 members of the unit that were allowed to settle in Canada after the war and is now a Ukrainian-Canadian citizen. Importantly, there is a precedent for his extradition. That's because in 2017, IPN prosecutors requested the extradition from the United States of another member of the same unit, Michael Karkoch, who had settled in Minnesota after the war. However, he died before that process was completed. Rivka, I've seen posts from various Canadian parliamentarians on Twitter and whatnot saying that we need to be vigilant against anti-Semitism and how this story undermines that, which is fair, that's good. But if they mean that we need to be vigilant against anti-Semitism, shouldn't this man be extradited and face justice in Poland?
I'm not going to challenge you, Aaron. I think that, extraditing war criminals, and this man is a war criminal. It's worth noting that, he wasn't just part of a unit of Ukrainians that happened to fight on the side of Nazis in the war. He was part of the Waffen-SS. These are people who staffed concentration camps, who shot people in mass graves. This man has seen and done things which you cannot imagine. Yeah. And so, of course, I think that he should face justice. But who else I think should face justice? People like Trudeau and people like his deputy prime minister, who's the granddaughter of another member of the SS who was rehabilitated or repatriated in Canada. And we need to ask ourselves, I think this is the important question, why are these people here? These people, like this 98-year-old Ukrainian Waffen-SS former member, are in Canada and in the UK and in Australia and in the States because we took them in after the war. We decided to take them in part because they were useful to us as potential intelligence agents and psyops during the Cold War, people who could discourage communist sympathies among diaspora communities in the aftermath of the Second World War and as the Cold War was kicking into gear. So it's us, the Western powers, who need to ask ourselves about our own murky dealings with these Nazis and why we accommodated them in order to further the Cold War and now the kind of ongoing rivalry with Russia. This is something that no Western power wants to confront, least of all Ukraine, which, who many years ago, or not even many years ago, I should say, in the recent past, was being confronted with its own right-wing and kind of neo-Nazi history and neo-Nazi present. But now any mention of the Azov battalion or now the Azov regiment, as it's been absorbed into the Ukrainian military, is met with accusations of Russian propaganda. We should be able to have both of these conversations at the same time. Why the conversation about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as the conversation about Ukraine and the West, Canada included, the UK included, are continuing rehabilitation of criminals of the Holocaust and of the Second World War in order to further our proxy war with Russia, both historically and in the present day. We need to be able to have both of those conversations at the same time. But making an example of a 98-year-old war criminal is not the way forward.